All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. My name is Brent Lundstrom. I am the director for the CCoE. We're really excited to kick off our monthly virtual town hall series where we're going to be bringing in subject matter experts to talk about a day in the life in the world of cybersecurity and the latest technologies. We'll be sharing educational resources and content that we think will be really valuable for our community and technical college leaders in cybersecurity education. So we have a pretty packed agenda today. We're going to go ahead and share a few updates and then kick things over to Amelia Phillips to talk about some of the latest and greatest from the PRCCDC. And then last but not least, we'll have Chris Lamb, our featured speaker today, talk about skills and abilities that WaTech is hiring for in the future and their enterprise cloud computing program. So just want to make sure that everyone is familiar and aware of the professional development funds that we have available to support Washington's community and technical college faculty. We can support up to $2,500 for boot camps, conferences, webinars, or seminars, trainings, certification fees. So if you are looking to get upskilled in your instruction and personal development, please apply. We have a QR code that you can scan here. We will share the slides post the call, as well as the recording. But you can find this content and the registration site on our website, which is coecyber.io. Also, just wanted to showcase that we are featuring colleges and their cybersecurity programs every month on our website. And we would love to interview you and talk about some of the highlights that you have for your cybersecurity program. You can reach out to my colleague, Nicole Schmidt, who can schedule an interview. We've been doing these every month and featuring them in our newsletter and on our site. And then last but not least, we are going to continue to do these town halls every month. We're going to have Vipul Kumar, who's going to share some of the latest and greatest on CyberRange Pulsebow and their latest version 3.0. So it will be a really insightful tour on the open educational resources that are available to our community and technical colleges to take advantage of for the CyberRange. So real excited about the latest developments there. We actually partnered with CyberRange Pulsebow on a workforce development grant and created 46 new labs that are available for free to consume on the CyberRange. So we certainly encourage you to take advantage of that, get signed up, and make that a part of your instruction. So I'm going to go ahead and have Amelia Phillips share a little bit about PRCCDC and what's happening this year.
Thank you, Brent, and hello, everyone. Happy Friday. So if you're not familiar, PRCCDC is the Pacific Rim Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. It is the regional qualifier for the national CCDC. And we've been, I think we're in our 18th or 19th year. Several of the schools in the state, and I think that are here right now, have participated. A lot of the students have imposter syndrome and get really challenged by participating. So this year in mid-November, it's looking like it'll be November 15th and 16th. We are hosting a free virtual Capture the Flag event, and it'll actually be hosted by Hack the Box. It is a team competition. The teams will be capped at 5 students. However, unlike CCDC, schools can have multiple teams competing. So the students just need access to a tablet or a computer. At this point, we look like we're going to run it. It'll start at 5 p.m. on the Friday and run until 5 p.m. on Saturday. There are different areas. There'll be cryptography, steganography, web, hardware, so a variety of things. If you just go out to the Hack the Box website, you'll see all the challenges, and it'll go from beginner to mid-range. So we will not be going into the expert level. PRCCDC for 2025 will be at South Puget Sound Community College, and it'll be March 21st through the 23rd, with the competition being on Friday, Saturday, and the job fair on Sunday. So thank you very much for your time. And it looks like there's a QR code down there for people to go ahead and go through our survey. And you can also just email me. And Brent has my email, so, and I can drop
Yeah,
it in the chat. So,
we'll make sure to post something on the website about all the things that are coming from PRCCDC and share an update as well on the website. So thanks so much, Amelia. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing a little bit about the latest and greatest.
okay, thank you, Brent. Appreciate the support.
Yeah. All right. Well, without further ado, I want to introduce Chris Lamb, and he is a program manager from WaTech and leads our enterprise cloud computing program. Done a lot of great work there at WaTech. He's had a storied career in Washington State's government, leading IT and digital transformation. And real thrilled to have Chris on the call and share a little bit about the skills and abilities as WaTech is migrating to the cloud and some of the personas and various skills that they're going to be hiring for in the future. So, Chris, did you want me to? You should be able to click share
Yeah,
screen.
I'll do another share here.
Okay,
Oh,
perfect.
I'm gonna say send request. Oh, you can request. No, I don't want to request. Probably looks like you got to get rid of it.
Okay, I will stop share.
Stop sharing. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
And there we go. Okay. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you, Brent. Mike, thanks for having me here. Very excited to be here. Happy to be here on an early Friday morning to talk to everybody. Very excited about this program. Just in the middle of the presentation, I got a lot to cover. There's a lot to this program. Hard to cover a lot, but going to try to focus in on the skills and stuff. But I'm also going to give a background on the program and how we got here and why we're doing it and the intent of the program. I can kind of see video. I can see my own presentation. I'm working from a small laptop because I'm off-site, but I can't see chat. So I'm going to count on Brent and Mike to help me out with chat if there's any chat.
You got it.
Thank you. My name is indeed Chris Lamb. I am the program manager for what is known as the Enterprise Cloud Computing Program for the state of Washington. It's housed at WaTech. I've been in multiple roles in the state. I've got a public sector career of 35 years, 30 of it in Washington State, in various roles. The 16 prior to this, I was in various CIO roles, building IT divisions, rebuilding IT divisions, transforming cultures, transforming organizations, things of that nature. At the time I took this position, I was the CIO for the Office of Financial Management, had been there for 5 years rebuilding IT there. And it was time to do something different, basically. And this position came up, and it is highly transformational, as you can imagine. And that is stuff that I'm very passionate about. I was on the steering committee for this program. At the time, I was the CIO to OFM as well. So, oops, lost my cursor. So I want to start. I will say too that if any time I don't stand on too much formality. So if there's any questions that come up, feel free to raise a hand or call me out and ask a question in the middle. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So I'm going to start out just with a little bit of a WaTech overview for those that aren't familiar with WaTech. The first thing to know before I talk about WaTech is that the state of Washington governmental structure is extremely painfully federated, which means every agency operates with a healthy dose of independence. They do have compliance and regulations and laws that they need to follow, and there are some about what the state CIO and WaTech set down for policy and standard that they do need to follow. But the bottom line is that they're not honestly locked in like a centralized model. They can take their own path if they choose to. If they can garner funding from the legislature and they decide to take a different path, it's up to them to argue for that. And if they get it, that's the way it is. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty, can be both a very powerful model because it allows agencies to function in a highly independent manner and be able to be very agile when it comes to solving their business missions. But in things like the cloud, it becomes a real hindrance because you then have the total of all agencies in the state doing all the stuff you need to do the cloud at the same time, which means you, instead of doing it once, which is what the proposal of the ECCP is, you have 90 agencies doing it 90 times. And that's where we get hurt by the federated environment. And that's a core philosophy and a core basis of what the ECCP as one program at WaTech stands for, is setting the foundational elements down for everybody so they don't have to worry about it. They can just problems on top of a core cloud foundation. WaTech itself is the central service IT agency for the state. In the state itself, there's approximately 4,500 FTEs in IT and general IT amongst the 90 generally recognized state government agencies. WaTech has 316 at the moment. They operate the state's core technology services, which is pretty much the central network and the data center, the state data center. It sits right next to the 1500 Jefferson Building in Olympia. They do the comprehensive information security around that network. So they're charged with guarding the perimeter, protecting state networks and against cyber threats. They also are on the hook legislatively for setting the strategic direction for the state. Again, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because all agencies are highly encouraged to keep that in their lens, but they all have business needs and sometimes they venture out a little bit. And so that federated model allows them to do that. But overall, the state CIO is responsible under the guise of WaTech to set the strategic direction and the enterprise architecture for IT in the state. They also oversee the entirety of the portfolio for major projects in the state. Right now, we have the HHS Coalition working on health records initiative that's very large across multiple agencies. We have the One Washington initiative that's going on that is replacing, it's basically implementing Workday as an ERP to replace our statewide accounting, our statewide HR. Those are huge, hundreds of millions of dollars of projects. And the state CIO is on the hook to oversee that through his office. And we do also, we are there to serve not only state agencies, but county, city, and tribal governments, public benefiting nonprofits. It's all in statute. So that's WaTech. WaTech also has a couple of different offices housed within it. Obviously, I already mentioned it, but the Office of Cybersecurity. It's oddly enough, that office has only been in statute since about 2011, I believe. Sorry, my box is covering that. Whoops. Let me make sure I get the date right. Oh, 2021. Yeah, okay. I don't know why I said 2011. 2021, where we've always had a de facto CISO, Chief Information Security Officer for the state, but it was never actually in statute, never actually even budgeted. It was kind of absorbed by the budget of WaTech. So it's only been the last 3 years we've actually had that office and the state CISO. Office of Privacy and Data Protection, I believe, has been around even a little bit longer. That was done before cybersecurity, but we also house that. We have the state's chief data officer, and they've been an entire program around protecting privacy and data in the state. This is just an example. I don't need to go through it too much, but some of the things I just talked about, this is a nice little slide that kind of talks about the statutory items in RCW that specifically call out what WaTech's responsibilities are. These slides will all be available to you after, and if you want to go through and look at these, that's not a problem. But things such as enterprise-based strategy and GIS is actually legislatively mandated in there. So there's several things in there that you can look for the RCW that talks about what WaTech is. So that's WaTech. WaTech is the central service IT agency for the state. A very difficult position and job in a highly federated environment, as you can imagine. Within WaTech, the ECCP was created, and it's just been recently that that's been created as well, although it's been a long, long road to get here. The legislature for about the last 8 to 10 years has sent varying messages that they want the state to move to the cloud. The original reason, there were two original reasons that the legislature initially proposed they wanted to move to the cloud. Number one was cost containment, which I think everybody who's in IT would probably chuckle because the cloud proposition, while there are some cases it can save you money, and there are places, a lot of places where you get more for your money, it doesn't really ever save you money. The other thing that they really called for, though, is 8-10 years ago, they were in a little bit of a budget crunch, nothing as bad as 2008, but they were very much interested in stopping these big IT spikes in legislative budget requests. They were getting tons of them, and in tough budget years, the legislature was having a very difficult time in trying to create and predict what budgets might be in the future. And so many of you have heard the topic of the change in paradigm from CapEx, capital expenditure, to OpEx, operating expenditure. The spikes in the budget is because we were primarily on-prem, and the legislature was getting a little tired of that. They wanted a more predictable budget, which OpEx can provide. When you're on a subscription-based service, you can come every biennium and say, hey, here's what we had, here's what the cost went up, here's what we anticipate, and it's a much flatter line. That was the proposition. And that all started 8 to 10 years ago. Over that time, it's morphed a lot because in true legislative fashion, they proposed some really good ideas, but the state was not in a position to really execute on that in a quick time frame. So one of the very first bills that came out was, okay, the state is going to move to the cloud in 6 months. And these bills were coming from people who were in the legislature that had come out of the IT community. And of course, in the IT community at the time, it was relatively easy as a CEO or CTO of a company to go, oh, we're just going to move our stuff in 6 months. For moving the entire state, 90 agencies and everything attached to it, it's a much different proposition. And we're also held to a lot different rules. And so that message continued. It continued to grow. There were lots of conversations and there were lots of things going on. And it finally came to a head where, I'm sorry, I'm getting to a timeline, I promise. In April of 2019, that conversation led to a cloud readiness assessment, where the legislature asked the current state CIO to conduct a cloud readiness assessment and give them the report on where are we with the state? What are you going to need? What does this look like? How long is this going to take? And in January 2021, that readiness assessment was delivered. In 2021 of April, after they received that cloud readiness assessment, they then produced some relatively innocuous legislation that basically said there's a piece of legislation in place already that said the agencies cannot have their own network, their own data closets. They can have their own networks as long as it's tied to the state government network, but they can't have their own stuff on-prem. In other words, they can't house their own little mini data closet data centers. So they mandated that everybody had to move all their on-prem stuff to the state data center. They updated that in April 21 to say data center, or you can be in a third-party cloud provider. That was their way of saying, we want you to start moving to the cloud. They heard that it was going to take a while, and it was their way of taking that first step of, we want you to start moving to the cloud, so we're opening that up. Okay. So they made it pretty explicit, even though agencies could already do that, they made it very explicit that they could do that. Another piece of that legislation that is of particular interest to this presentation, because we're talking about skill sets, is they also created this workforce transition task force, which is a mouthful for me to say every time. And they wanted it to assess what a move to the cloud, what that impact would be on the state's IT workforce. And what they found was kind of what we feared, is we are way behind the times, and the impact would be very large. We were woefully behind in skill sets. So based on that legislation in 2021, in July of 2021, WaTech went ahead and created the ECCP. In November of 21, the Workforce Transition Task Force, they delivered their report and their recommendations to the legislature. Those recommendations, and we'll talk about that here in just a second, those all went into the state's cloud smart strategy, along with other things. And I'm going to show you that here in a second. There's a link to the cloud smart strategy that when you get these slides should work. You should be able to get to that. I would recommend that you stick to looking at the first half of that report. The second half the strategy. The second half is about 80 to 90% done, in my opinion, when I picked up the program. It has objectives and deliverables in it, but I believe it needs to be readdressed here in the very near future to kind of tweak it. Since I've come on, we've taken a little bit of a course change on where we're headed and what the vision of the program is. So that's how we've gotten to where we are today and the birth of the ECCP. So I want to talk about the Cloud Smart strategy. That it's a whole document. You can feel free to read through that. But the Cloud Smart strategy is predicated on 5 separate goals. They have 5 strategic goals, and those are the goals of the ECCP. The first one is what we call foundation. I always love the title, Statewide Framework to Coordinate and Accelerate Cloud Migrations. Some of these statements they have with them, I honestly am not sure I know what they mean, so I'm going to explain them to you. Goal 1 foundation is all around 2 foundational elements of the program. One is all the technical capabilities that you need to operate a foundational cloud environment. Not the entire environment for the state, but the foundational cloud for the state. Setting up a shared WaTech tenant for Azure and AWS, creating the cloud networking that'll be needed, that people don't have to build themselves, that they can leverage, that WaTech can also see into and observe and protect and metric. There's a second foundation, which is programmatic foundations. There are things in our program, vendor management, project management, FinOps, things of that nature that need to be built up as operations within the program. Those also fall under Goal 1. Goal 2, and this is the one that's primarily what we're focused on today, is around workforce. It talks all about that workforce transition task force. And in fact, the 4 bullets in the cloud strategy that you will find under Goal 2 are a direct translation from the workforce transition task force. They are the 4 recommendations coming out of there. And it deals with a retraining program. It deals with a learning platform. It deals with a training paths and learning paths and supporting employees such that their skills are transferable across the state. So that, because right now, although there's a good portion of what people learn and are trained for in Agency A, many times it doesn't always translate completely over to Agency B. And so trying to set that foundation so that if somebody promotes in their career and takes a new job, those skills are easily transferable to another agency. Goal 3 for the strategy is consulting. Well, that's all about helping agencies get there. We have, and I have a slide in here that'll kind of break it down for you. We have about 60-70% of our agencies are somewhere in the cloud, Most of them are kind of in the dip your toe in the water phase. We have some that are a little bit further down the road, although I will tell you that most of those that I talk to are very clear with me. Oh, they didn't do it right. It was basically lift and shift, and they haven't really optimized or done it as a focused effort. And that honestly is not a swipe at those agencies because they have about a dozen, 24 things going on every biennium. They got to compete, they got to complete on top of this small thing that's the cloud migration, right? So, and we have about a quarter of the state that has no clue how to get going. They are like, we don't know how to do this. We need help. And this consulting goal is all around that. It's not only giving access to third-party consultants when it's needed, but it's also building an internal ECCP consulting function. Having our own, we are currently calling them navigators. We don't have any, but we want to build a navigator program to where if somebody comes to us and says, we don't know how to start, the navigator comes equipped with tools and methodologies in order to assess and identify and help them plan and provide services and walk them through the entirety of that journey to the cloud. Goal 4 is what we call brokerage. This is really all around consolidating and negotiating economy of scale contracts for large scale CSPs and other cloud services. Right now, every agency has their own contract. Now, so most of you may know that the Department of Enterprise Services is in charge of doing centralized contracting. We have something called our master contracts, and agencies leverage those as much as possible because they're already set and they're very valuable. We can just go out there. We don't have to go through an RFP. We can leverage those because they've already been vetted and people have competed to get on that list. And people and agencies can use that, and that's very powerful. We're not that part of it. We're not proposing anything different, and in fact, we'll be partnering with DES on that. But what ends up happening is that DES is very good at acquiring contracts, but they're not an IT agency. And right now there's a gap between getting the contract and ensuring that not only we're getting the best price across all agencies, leveraging those economies of scale, but also ensuring that our security compliance, our security design reviews, the architectural compliances, the privacy compliances, our data retention and public disclosure compliances, those are not really accounted for in those contracts. And one of the goals of the ECCP is to take that burden from the agencies so that they, every time they sign a contract, they don't have to go through an SDR. They don't have to security design review. They don't have to go through a privacy review. They don't have to go through all these things. They're already established and they're done once. Remember, I referenced about building this, so we only have to do things once. So that's what brokerage is all about. And finally, this is all wrapped around goal 5, which is a marketplace. Concept of a marketplace is probably not new to anybody. It's the ability for agencies to self-serve. In our current vision, this is an online shopping cart where all the services are available. Our processes are all behind the scenes. We're even talking about AI-generated navigation to supplement the consulting services. So you can actually just have an AI help you. Unless you need a person, you can do it both ways. But goal 5 is all around making sure that WaTech is not standing in the way of divvying out these services, that we've provided a marketplace that allows agencies to self-serve, and all the processes have been automated as much as possible to get them on the cloud as fast as possible without WaTech being an inhibitor to that. So the outcomes of all that, it should be obvious, but these are just the defined outcomes that we talk about in the program. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it. They're all pretty common. One thing I will say is that I'm up here kind of pontificating about the greatness of the ECCP, and I absolutely adore the ECCP, and I am fully vested in it. There is nothing that we are doing that any other state isn't doing already. Many, many states are doing these things. What I will say, though, is that in my travels and talking to a lot of these other states, while there are components of these things that agencies are doing and doing, or I'm sorry, states are doing, and states are doing very well, I have yet to see this very aspirational, foundational, cohesive, integrated program around all these things. So we understand this is a very large lift, and there's a lot going on here. So next, I want to talk about what ECCP. These are our current work streams, the work in flight around ECCP. So it's important to note that in support of that, I'm sorry, hang on one second. Hold on one second. Alexa decided to go off there for a second, so I apologize. Okay, let me get back to it. Okay, so in support of the Cloud Smart strategy, the program's undertaken a lot of research and information gathering efforts. And one of these we're going to expand on a little bit because I promise I'm getting to some of the meat of what we've been talking about. But spending time on this because it's really important to understand the background of ECCP and context of all of this. So we have three things that we're going on right now. This cloud capability model, which is it's a framework. And what it really does in its simplest terms is it's aligning what capabilities we need to do the cloud with what services WaTech needs to have in place to deliver those cloud services. And it identifies those gaps. So it's really a capability gap model, but we call it the CCM. There's an agency workforce readiness assessment that we did. It's a supplement to some of the work that the Workforce Transition Task Force did. It was a direct engagement with 18 agencies that comprised a healthy dose of our current general IT workforce. They're interviewed, and we looked at readiness areas that absolutely dealt in workforce, but also dealt in cloud strategy, technology, and organization. And I'll explain why we expanded that past workforce here in a second. The third one is our customer journey mapping and service blueprints. And this is all around the development of the vision for the program. What does this look like to a customer agency? So, and this work, both these last two are already done. All three of these are things that we're going to consolidate, and we're moving into right now an effort to define the 3 to 5 roadmap, 3 to 5 year strategic roadmap for the program. When I first came on board, the program had been going for about a year and a half, and it had really struggled to get participation, to get information, to really find direction. So one of the first things we did were these three things all for the goal of actually having a physical strategic roadmap that we can point to that says, here's what the vision is, and here's how we're going to get there. Again, not anything anybody hasn't done before, but very important for the program. This is just a slide that kind of talks about that. The CCM framework is the diagonal set of stuff there that just identifies cloud capabilities. We map them to service. We do an analysis. Those gaps go into a prioritization, which is our road mapping effort. And on top, you have the separate journey, customer journey, workforce readiness stuff, and it all goes into our ECCP strategic plan, which I actually should call that the strategic roadmap, not the plan. Some other things that we're doing because we knew we needed to get them going and we knew they were no-brainers. They were things we could keep going before getting the roadmap done, and there's others that we're going to be doing as well. But our cloud government network, this is networking in the cloud. Having that baseline networking in the cloud that all agencies can tap into without having to create it. Right now, based on policy, we have what's called the state government network. It is a fully on-prem networking solution. It is also, it's the old school stuff, and our Office of Cybersecurity has observability into it. Agencies that are in the cloud, our Office of Cybersecurity, and even just our performance people in WaTech, they have no visibility into that because everybody's signed their own contract and they've built their own tenancy. So Cloud Government Network is basically trying to take the tenets of SGN and put it in the cloud. It also is we're building that for efficiency's sake, because right now, if you can believe it, because of policy, if somebody has an Azure instance in the cloud, everything they do has to ping back to the SGN, because by requirement to do networking, you have to be on the SGN. And so if I'm doing an AWS instance to another AWS instance, or an Azure to an Azure, or an Azure to AWS, whereas usually you just go straight through in the cloud, right now, you have to go ping back and forth to the SGN and go back and forth. And obviously that's highly inefficient. So the second thing we're doing is we are getting ready to start. We're creating a negotiation team, working with our Attorney General's office, contracting with a special AG to start those cloud service provider contract negotiations. That's going to be a big effort. So I want to move on to the agency and workforce readiness. That was the second one, second that I talked about. I want to talk about the themes that came out of there real quickly. And this is a slide I referenced before that talks about where our agencies and our workforce are. So about half, as you can see, 55%, they have their toes dipped in the water, basically. They don't have a plan. They've kind of started doing some cloud. Somebody asks for cloud training, they do it, but they don't really have a plan, but they're trying. 25% are at a starting point. They don't even really know how to get started. And there's 20% that are kind of in the maturation process. But as I said, most of them have already, are fully admit that it's like, okay, we did it, but we're pretty sure we didn't do it correctly. I mean, it works and all of that, but boy, our bills are big and the efficiency of the operations isn't really that great. So the key themes that came out of there were around that the agencies don't understand their role in the state. This is coming from our federated environment. They don't really understand that stuff very well. They don't understand what their role is. And so a communication effort on our part and OCM on our part is really important. They're struggling to build and execute their cloud roadmaps because they don't know how to get it started. They don't know what they need. WaTech is becoming a hindrance because the WaTech processes are still built on singular services, most of them originally designed around on-prem. They need a cloud workforce strategy, which for this group is a no-brainer. They understand the importance of OCM, but they don't know how to do it. They really lack OCM skills. Funding is a major challenge. And this one is partially on the ledge as well. Remember, I talked about that the ledge originally 8 to 10 years ago was very much about, hey, we don't want to see these big spikes in IT spend. We want to see more. We want to move you from CapEx to OpEx. Well, these days you have that conversation with them and they're coming and asking, well, why do you need more money for your cloud stuff? That's a typical question we'll get, and it goes with that last key theme on the page, where not only agencies but even the ledge at times, because the ledge in 8 years has rolled over, they don't quite understand what OpEx means. They don't understand how to manage FinOps, and those are things that the program is going to need to take on. So from those themes came recommendations, which of course these three should be no-brainers again for this group, because this is why we're here talking today. We need to develop a cloud workforce strategy that is enterprise-wide, that agencies can leverage. We need to map all our cloud personas to agency roles because we have an existing set of IT job families, and we need to create these connections between personas and roles. And we need to develop these comprehensive learner journeys so that for each of these personas, we can define what somebody should be knowledgeable in order to be successful in that role. We also need to work internally in WaTech and better position our staff to understand and execute upon that cloud smart strategy, right? We need to complete this vision, which we actually just did. And we need to do a more concerted internal OCM effort. WaTech is under a significant culture change, and they have come a long way. Mr. Kehoe, our state CIO, has done an amazing job with his staff in moving us in the right direction. But we still need to work on breaking ourselves out of thinking about those siloed services and thinking more of how do we deliver business value. And creating service strategy that aligns to the vision and preparing our staff with training. but we need to work internally a little bit more. Establishing cloud foundation and migration patterns, building the cloud strategy and visioning services so we can help agencies with their education and planning, and creating guidance for strategic funding. So how do we talk to the legislature around decision packages and requests for money? So training. Out of that report also came a training recommendations. And this is the path that we're going down right now. In preparation, cloud learning platform, which for us, we have signed a 3-year contract with Pluralsight, and we're in the middle of implementing that. But we need to, we originally developed, and this happened before I came on board, is they developed 12 IT personas, which is back to the recommendation we got. These pretty closely align with our IT job families, although it's not 100% complete. So these are the 12 personas that you will see in Pluralsight to start with. Obviously, this can grow and shrink depending upon need, but these are the 12 that are defined. And the way they did it, I'm going to show you one example, is every one of those personas has this type of a specification to it. It describes what an app, in this case, what an app developer is and what they do and what it means to them to work in the cloud, what a typical job role is, what their core competencies should be from a high level. And they did this work for all 12. And then from the program, that agency workforce readiness effort, they came with approach to training. So recommended basic training that absolutely everyone should take, stuff that goes across all personas. Then they have recommended training for all the target areas, which is the 12%. They have target areas for each persona. And then they actually gave us a very robust skills matrix. And I'm going to show you just a quick example of that here in a second. So the training recommendations for the state, this is for the state. This is very specialized for the state. This could map to a lot of other places, but for the state, these were the 5 that were identified as training that absolutely everybody should take. We still have gaps in knowledge about what Cloud 101, what is cloud, how does it work? I mentioned the cost modeling, the FinOps and OpEx versus CapEx. Security training for everybody. Security should be built into every place because it's built into the cloud paradigm. Just cloud platform training. Just what are these platforms? How do they work? AWS, Azure, and Google, and Oracle, and all these other ones, they all have different ways of thinking about how they implement cloud. And then cloud services overview, which is a nod towards the WaTech services. And then in the middle, we have target areas. They split it into 6. You'll see personas on the left, and you'll see the knowledge area that they need. And they actually talk about entry level, advanced working, and expert, and how you would progress through that. And that they recommend building all 3 learning paths for each persona. And they have them for all 12. This is just the second page. And then we have this very, very robust skills matrix that I'm hoping is going to show up. Can everybody see this coming up?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good.
You
So
see
it's kind of
skills
yeah, it's pretty big. It's going to be hard to read. I apologize, but what I'm really just trying to show is that this is a very detailed. It's about 450 lines of all the personas across the top and all the core competencies down the side. And
we see those slides.
I'm sorry?
We just see the slide. Is that what you want us to
Just
look
see
at?
the slide. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and skip this since I'm running out of time, but I was hoping it would show. But the basic takeaway from this is that it's a huge Excel spreadsheet that maps the personas with about 450 competency areas. And it highlights that this competency area is valid for these personas, and they should train in this, and they should train in this. And it identifies very specifically what concepts and skill sets each persona should have. And that all came out of the agency readiness recommendations as well. That is a skills matrix at that level that we can pick up and hand to our Pluralsight partners and start analyzing it to create those learning paths within Pluralsight. So that is where we're headed right now. Well, one of the questions I was asked is, what are the most in-demand skills? That is a two-part question. There are a set of there's a set of in-demand. So remember, the state is highly federated. And so when I talk about in-demand skills, what I'm really talking about is skills at the agency level. I will also talk about for the program what we're focused on, because we're not really in the operations. We're in strategy, coordination, driving projects, getting things to implemented, but it's all with our operational partners to make it happen. And so there's two different skill sets that we're talking about there. But for the state right now, if we look at these 12 personas, you can kind of play a game and see if you can guess what the four biggest are. But from our perspective, the four biggest needs we have, one of them is IT architect. We have a good cadre of IT architects, but IT architecture in the state is kind of seen as the big thinkers. And they have some really fantastic ideas. They have some really good ways of thinking about, they can envision the future. But where we struggle in the state is helping us get from point A to that future vision, right? So, and that skill set is hard to come by. Architects in the private sector, it's hard to compete with that, what is being offered in the private sector. But architecture is one of our biggest needs, especially when it comes to cloud. Another one that's highly needed is data. Now you'll notice I'm not pointing at application development yet at all. App dev is very important, but the world and the state, like the world, is finally catching up to the fact that data is actually God, not building applications. Data is the center of everything we do. And in order to get our apps right, or our dashboards right, or our reports right, or our warehouses right, or all that data provides, we got to get that right. And having strong data management, data architecture is something that's very much in need in the state. Security will always be one of the biggest things. IT security is very hard to compete for out in the private sector. They just pay them a lot more. We pay pretty well in the state from the state standpoint, but out in the real world, we are woefully behind. So our skill gap in IT security is real. And the last one is because as our skill sets and our inability to compete with wages continues, we are going to be relying more and more on contracted services. And so vendor management is something that becomes a big deal. Vendor management used to be relegated to our licensing specialists. They used to be relegated to like one person sitting at a computer making sure that all our licenses were up to date. We're now talking about full-on formal IT vendor management, which is a big part of my job, as you can imagine. I have a lot of contract services helping me implement this program. In my opinion, and I need to emphasize, this is my opinion, these, with my experience in the state over the last 30 years, these are the four biggest areas that the state really, really needs to grow and are in demand. And when I look at the additional skills that are very much in demand, moving into the cloud, portfolio management is a big one. The state really doesn't seem very skilled or understanding of what portfolio management really is right now. Agencies have a hard time understanding what it can do for you. And so getting a grip on that, especially around when you move to cloud and the things you're doing, the things you're managing in your portfolio are subtly changed. That understanding is going to be something that is going to be very important for us moving forward. And then, of course, I've called it out many times, our FinOps and cost optimization is going to be a big deal. So from the ECCP standpoint, I have 3 positions that I'm looking to hire within the next 6 months. One is communications and OCM. From an enterprise standpoint, this is a huge piece. You noticed that one of the key themes was that agencies didn't really understand all this yet. They're still struggling to understand what this paradigm means. And that position is going to help a lot with that. Vendor brokerage specialist is somebody who's going to help me with vendor management, but also in contract negotiations, along with our special AG. And then, of course, a FinOps specialist, which we've talked about many times. So what are the next steps for the ECCP? So we're going to
Hey,
execute.
Chris,
Yeah.
When you say like vendor management, do you see vendor risk and having kind of a security mindset in that type of role is important at all, or is it just purely managing vendors? And then another question that came up in the chat was, are you familiar with the NICE workforce framework, which defines 52 different work roles? It's a NIST framework that was developed.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
And is
Good
that
question.
something you guys are using?
Yeah, good question. So the risk question first. So it's absolutely on my mind. In fact, I've had whenever I bring contractors in, vendors in, they engage. I have the security team engaged full on, and privacy, the two offices that I highlighted in the beginning. And they're very much at the table in these conversations. And the contractor is well aware, because it's one of the major components of an onboarding conversation we have with them, about the things that we need to address. And if I see that they're not addressing those things, and I'm bringing this up because I've already had one vendor where terminated the relationship because they were too focused on their packaged stuff, the way they package it, the way they deliver it. It's like, this is our package. This is what you get. And I'm like, yeah, but that part doesn't work in government. That part doesn't work for our risk tolerance. That part doesn't work for our security profile. Doesn't work for privacy. Doesn't work for PDR. And they consistently push back with, well, yeah, but this is easier, right? Yeah, that relationship terminated very quickly. So as just one example of that, yes, we take that very seriously, and it's part of every conversation we have. I'm currently working with a vendor named Slalom. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with them. They did our customer journeys. One of the major components that we talked about is updating the security design review process within those customer journeys. And they took that very seriously. They engaged, they understood the assignment. They didn't just give me well, here's how it usually works. They went in and dug very deep on what are the current requirements, what are the current processes, how can we clean this up but keep the same compliances. So that answer is absolutely very important. The NICE workforce, I am aware of it. It has been looked at. But what I will tell you, and I apologize for being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here on this answer, the state of Washington suffers from what do I call it? Persistent uniqueness. So while we very much have an eye towards that, we have an eye towards a lot of things, because we always look to know what is our model, right? Even the NIST CSF, which is what the OCS, the new security, CISO, and the OCS, we're revamping our entire security policy framework. They're pointing at NIST CSF. So they've adopted that, but they've also tweaked it quite a bit to meet what we need. So yes, I'm very aware of it, but we're not adopting it as, in whole. I hope that answered the question. I'm sorry, I can't see anything but my presentation at the moment, and I don't know why. So
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Okay.
you answered my question. Thank you so much
Okay.
for addressing that.
You bet. Thank you. So we're gonna execute the rollout of the cloud learning platform. That is underway. We are starting with a wave 1 of 34 agencies that are, it includes those 18. And as you can probably guess by the math, it's about 85-90% of all general IT staff are in those 34 agencies. So we had a lot of the bigger agencies in that readiness assessment, even though we did include small agencies in that as well. But as we go into the next wave, there's going to be a lot less IT staff involved with those agencies. Washington State has a ton of small agencies. We got Beef Commission, Beer Commission, there's these tons of these small agencies that don't really have a lot of IT staff, or none. Some of them rely on WaTech small agency services to handle that. So there's some agencies we won't even roll on because they don't have any. But we're in the middle of doing that. We are rolling agencies on now, and we are also parallel building the learning paths. We want them to be able to have access to the Pluralsight platform because we bought them the everything license, which gives them access to absolutely anything and everything Pluralsight has. And then by the end of the year, we'll have the learning paths done, probably sooner than that, but we'll have that done and roll that out to them too. And we're also giving agencies the abilities to build their own learning paths. Remember that we're highly federated, and we want our paradigm is we want agencies to have as much flexibility as possible. So we're going to build a foundational set and go, look, if you don't know where to start, this is where you should be starting. But you do have the option to build their own, and they can take their own path if they want. We're going to begin negotiation on the CSP contracts, and we're going to begin revamping our service delivery. I am in the middle of working on multiple things, as well as the roadmap that will move towards this and reimagining what our service delivery in WaTech looks like. We're also going to be doing a proof of concept for cost optimization. I have an agency that has done a lift and shift, and I have a company that specializes in this. And so I'm doing a POC to see if they provide value and can help throughout the state to do this analysis and make recommendations on how people can make their costs more efficient. And we're also doing a proof of concept on cloudability, which is a part of Aptio. This is all around budgeting, forecast management, dashboarding. Aptio is something the state already has, so we're going to see if cloudability meets our needs or not. And then, of course, very important is developing that roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years. Okay, I apologize. I really thought I was going to struggle to get through a half hour, but apparently I just talked too much. If you need any more, I will provide these slides. My contact information is here, but I will make sure you have those slides, and I will open it up for the last few minutes of questions.
Chris, thank you so much. I mean, I think, since we have our community and technical colleges that are a part of the call, what would you say is the appetite for partnering with colleges to fill some of these gaps and roles? And what would you say would be an avenue for, our technology programs to connect and collaborate within Washington's government?
I'd say, me personally, especially as I've worked in those executive roles, the appetite is huge. I've had many conversations. I still have many conversations because I have good relationships, with all the CIO community, statewide HR, things of that nature. And we constantly are trying to brainstorm, how do we get pipelines of college graduates into the state? How do we get new talent into the state? They obviously worry about retention as well, but how do you partner with colleges and get them into the state? I'm a very transparent guy, but we in the state have to really change our paradigm and how we think. We are still shifting from some old school thinking. I still have conversations where I have managers, supervisors telling me, "Oh, we got to hang on to this person. We got to, we got to give them more responsibility. We got to promote them," which is great. We got to give them more money, which is great. But it's usually in the context of, "Oh, I have this developer, and if I don't promote him within my group, then he's going to leave for a management or CIO position out here." To me, that's the entire wrong mindset, because we're kind of strangleholding this person by throwing more money at him and saying, "Well, if you stay here and just do this for me, because I don't want to have to deal with it as a leader, then that would be great." When really we're kind of strangleholding these people from growing their careers and growing what they want to do. We also need to get over this idea, because I've had these conversations about, well, I can't afford to bring somebody in and train them up. I can't afford to bring somebody in who doesn't have X number of years of experience and a degree and all of this. We got to get over that in the state. It's my opinion that if I can get somebody new and we bring them in and I get 2-3 years of great work out of them with all this new diversity and new thinking and people coming right into the job market from actually the real world, not people who've been embedded in government process for 30 years, to me, that's fantastic. And even if they go, hopefully they'll go somewhere else in the state, which means the state still keeps a good employee. Or maybe they go to private sector and they have a great career out there, which means the state did its job and grew a citizen. To me, that's the paradigm we have to be going on. And in order to do that, if we move to that, then we can start talking about, well, how do we partner and bring those people in, right? Because if we do that with colleges and we bring them in, and then we just keep our old model, people are going to come in, and the only thing they're going to send back to the other people that are coming up behind them is, don't come here because they don't support you, right? So
Yeah.
so number one, the answer is yes. There is a huge need for, I don't know why my laptop is draining here, but there is a huge need for us to partner with colleges and find these new pipelines. I got to rethink a little bit. And internships is definitely something that we've considered. Paid internships, they'd be paid internships. I think the state needs to get better at building an internship program, because right now, in my experience, middle managers aren't willing to do the extra stuff that you need to do for internships. Which I'm really big on leadership accountability. I push my managers all the time, like, I don't care about that. That's your job, right? We want these people to come in and do this, right? So, but there's still this old school thinking a little bit in there. The question from Theo, training build outs for IT persona is going to be available. So right now, it's a good question. Right now, I want to mention that my program is paid through what's called an allocation, which means that there's about 90 agencies that all fund mandatorily. They pay into my program for me to do that job. Right now, they're the ones that paid for the Pluralsight platform. So they are the ones that are getting access to it right now. It's limited to them. The vision of the program is to expand it all the way out. Now, how that gets paid for, that's the only key thing that needs to be hammered out to offer this outside of those 90 agencies. Is if we're successful, this is my takeaway, is if we're successful and we prove the value to all these agencies, we can start branching out and go, hey, if you guys contribute to the program, we can offer this, and this. And one of those would be the learning platform. The personas themselves, I'm happy to share with anybody who wants to see them. I have a copy of them, all 12. I'm happy to share that. So that's easily, I can pass that on to Brent and he can share that with you.
Yeah. Well, maybe the Center of Excellence can play a role in helping WaTech develop some internship programs. We'd love to collaborate.
That would be awesome. I am having a couple conversations, although I feel bad because I can't commit as much time to it, with SPSCC in Olympia, where I'm located. And they're doing a bachelor's and other things, but we're constantly talking to them and trying to connect them with OFM HR, because I'm not at OFM anymore. And that's where that conversation needs to happen, is OFM statewide HR. And Michaela Dolman, great lady. I'm sure she's more than happy to have those conversations. She's always looking for that stuff.
Awesome. Well, Chris, we'll definitely make sure to have your contact information, some of the slides that you shared, those personas with this group. Really, thank you so much for your time and sharing a little bit of information about how our IT operations work here in the state. So it was really, really powerful. I just wanted to highlight that we are going to be hosting these virtual town halls every month. Our next session is going to be on November 8th, featuring Cyber Range Paulsbo and their latest version 3.0. We want to just share with you some of the resources that have become available on there, and make sure that you're familiar with the latest and greatest from CRP. So we would encourage you to register for that session. If you have ideas about content that you would like to see, if there's resources or skills or different topics, please let us know and contact us. We would love to just bring you the right presentations and speakers so that this becomes a more powerful and collaborative resource for you. So with that, I know we're a few minutes over. If there aren't any questions, we'll go ahead and finalize things today. Hopefully you all found this to be valuable, and thanks so much for joining us. Any questions? Going once, going twice. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your Friday and have a great weekend. Thanks so much.